Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Anthony Peake Consciousness Hour. This one is going to be a really interesting one because it's bringing together myself and Sarah Janes and Dr. David Luke, which is really good because the three of us were involved a few years ago in a fascinating event at Drakelow Caves, which, if we get the opportunity, we will talk about. Just bear with me a second. There's one more thing I need to load, and we'll take it from there. Yeah. So today we're going to be talking about matters of really fascinating interest, and Dr. David Luke is somebody whose work I've admired for so long, and I was so delighted when I had the opportunity to meet him at one of the breaking conventions a few years ago. When I did a presentation there, and David was very, very helpful in pointing out one or two of the things that I'd said that were slightly misleading and things which was really wonderful of him to do, which was really good because it's important you get your facts right. So those of you who don't know of Dr. David Luke, he's Associate Professor of Psychology at the University of Greenwich. His research focuses on transpersonal experiences, anomalous phenomena and altered states of consciousness, especially via psychedelics. Having published more than 100 academic papers in this area, including 10 books, most recently Otherworlds, Psychedelics and Exceptional Human Experience, 2nd edition 2019. When he's not running clinical drug trials with LSD, conducting DMT field experiments, or observing apparent weather control with Mexican shamans, he directs the Ecology, Cosmos and Consciousness Salon and is a co-founder and director of Breaking Convention, the International Conference on Psychedelic Consciousness. Now, I have to say to everybody out there, if you go to one event in your life, go to Breaking Convention. It is simply wonderful. You can have up to 1,000 people there. It takes place at the University of Greenwich. The weather is usually wonderful. The discussions are fantastic. Please, and David and I will chat a little bit about this event as well. So, straight away, David, can you tell us just a little bit about your work? Give yourself a bit of a background about you, how you ended up doing what you're doing, and what work you are involved in at the moment in terms of your research.
Yeah, thank you, Anthony. And Sarah, thanks for inviting me along. I'm a psychologist by training, but I was always interested in extraordinary experiences, like dabbling around with my own brain, like a neurochemistry play set, and seeing what kind of experiences came out of that. And so I went away and studied psychology, of course, and I've been stuck in that area ever since, really. Over the course of my career, I've been exploring kind of parapsychological phenomena, ESP, primarily precognition, but also out-of-body experiences, near-death experiences, and also into the more transpersonal realm of experiences. Those experiences which take you beyond your own ego identity, what we might call transpersonal, things like entity encounters or mystical experiences, or even possession states or whatever it might be. So loosely, it's kind of like the study of altered states of consciousness under the umbrella of psychology, but the anomalous or transpersonal, paranormal or exceptional kind of experiences which kind of ensue in those states. That's what I've been doing on my holidays, pretty much.
What actually stimulated you to become interested in this particular area of psychology? Was it personal experiences or something more?
Yeah, a bit of both, really. I mean, I didn't say what the other one was, but the other would be just kind of academic interest, I used to kind of skive off school from an early age and go down to the secondhand bookshop and just read all the kind of left field science and esoterica instead of going to school, which I found to be a much better education, to be honest with you. And but was always interested in that kind of stuff, and of course started having lots of interesting experiences as a teenager, dabbling with psychedelics and altered states of all varieties. So that's what drew me to it, and I went to study psychology specifically to try and understand these experiences, but was woefully disappointed because they don't really teach about that kind of thing on a psychology degree. That's the only reason I ended up in the academy, really, I would say.
Yeah, because that is the frustrating thing, isn't it? There seems to be still this hangover of the materialist reductionist model, which is not a problem in itself, but it seems that psychology and sociology and the social sciences seem to be so preoccupied with their scientific credibility that they can't move on from it, can they? Which is extraordinary because people do have anomalous experiences. And of course, my next question, which is of great interest to me, and I'm sure many people out there, is that what is it? Well, first, explain what psychedelics are for everybody. But secondly, then, I'm really interested to know why is it that psychedelics can bring about, how is it that chemicals placed in the brain can bring about extraordinary experiences? We call them hallucinations or whatever, but what is really happening there? So how do psychedelics work, and what do they do that makes us see the world differently?
Okay, thank you for that. So to define psychedelics, I would say they are chemicals primarily, or sometimes they're kind of plant-based, occasionally animals, or animal excretions usually, not the whole animal, that can change your state of consciousness in profound qualitative ways, unlike, other drugs, psychoactive drugs like, amphetamines or cocaine, which just kind of basically stimulate you. Psychedelics change every aspect of your experience, of your state of consciousness, your self-identity, your emotions, your sense of meaning of the world, time and space, your perceptions. Everything can change under the state of a psychedelic. How they actually work, that's a big question. I mean, we have a few kind of neurobiological pieces of the jigsaw puzzle, but I would say that they do tend to induce these kinds of extraordinary experiences because they change our perceptions. So they give us access to a change of consciousness, which allows us to perceive the world in a very different way. Now, the thing is, we're hallucinating all the time anyway, right? Even when we're awake in kind of so-called sober, ordinary state of consciousness, the world outside isn't the world that we see. We see this kind of human simulacra of it, and everybody experiences the world differently as well, of course, because some people have synesthesia and some people have ADHD and other people have aphantasia, and there's all these kind of different neurodivergent ways of experiencing the world. So it's not even the same to any two humans, and what's out there isn't really what we perceive, because your brain fills in the gaps a lot of the times, and we know that from visual illusions. So we're hallucinating constantly. It's just that psychedelics give us access to a different perspective on our kind of our consensus hallucination. That's my kind of general take on it. But there are kind of neurobiological kind of pointers in some of this. For instance, we're finding now that psychedelics are finally being studied neuroscientifically, that there are kind of key changes in the brain. There seems to be this reduction of activity in what's called the default mode network, which is a bit like your kind of ego identity, the sense in which when you're kind of thinking about the future or ruminating on the past, and when that kind of goes down, it kind of takes off the shackles of the brain and gives you this kind of hyperconnectivity where all these disparate regions of the brain are suddenly all kind of communicating with each other. Now, the trouble is we don't know what consciousness is really, and we can look to kind of neural correlates, and that can give us a few pointers, but I would say we don't necessarily understand the nature of consciousness anyway, but that we kind of, it's fairly well accepted that we are kind of experiencing a permanent hallucination anyway, but psychedelics give us access to a different kind of hallucination, as do other altered states.
Because it is, isn't it, the concept of naive realism, the idea that most people, if you turn around to people and say, is there a one-to-one relationship between what I'm perceiving internally, the internal model of reality that's been created by my brain, and the external reality, most people will quite naturally say, well, yeah, it's the same, you're just perceiving what is out there. But, a moment's reflection will say that that can't be the case. The very fact, for instance, that the blind spot disappears, that kind of, even to the little thing that consciousness fills in, or the visual cortex or whatever fills in that section of that part of reality in order to give us a continual field. But in terms of this, in terms of psychedelic experiences, what is the relationship with, I don't know, as you call it, transpersonal states or paranormal-like experiences? Because there does seem to be many parallels between the two. And what does your research and work come across in terms of that type of thing?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess you could probably fit paranormal-like experiences under the umbrella of transpersonal, because they usually involve some sense of deeper connection with some kind of other, be it like a telepathic experience, or maybe just a connection with the future, like in terms of precognition, or a sense of going beyond your ego identity by having an out-of-body experience. So I think these kind of two terminologies are fairly interchangeable, although transpersonal is probably a bigger umbrella. I guess, I've kind of almost forgotten the question, but I guess some of the ways in which these come about is they give you access to your unconscious material, right? In some regards, like that all the things we don't ordinarily have access to in our waking state of consciousness, or the kind of the symbolic, non-linear, associative kind of material that often surfaces in dreams, suddenly becomes accessible in these altered states of consciousness, and leading to either transpersonal or parapsychological phenomena.
Okay, so what kind of phenomena will we be talking about here when somebody takes psychotropic substances or whatever? What, in your experience, are the typical type of paranormal, parapsychological states that people experience?
Well, Groff did quite a big job of cataloging a lot of these. Stanislav Grof, who was like one of the pioneering psychedelic psychiatrists, and did thousands of psychedelic assisted psychotherapy sessions in the 60s and 70s. He kind of cataloged them into various types. The three main types, basically. One was the experiential extension within consensus space-time reality, right? So these are just kind of really far out experiences which don't necessarily define anything about the nature of reality, but are pretty surreal, like maybe kind of going back, having the experience of going back through the entire genetic history to the kind of primordial soup, and re-experiencing or experiencing what it's like to be all those different species that you've evolved from. Now, they're not particularly common, but they definitely do happen, and it's a kind of classic kind of transpersonal experience you might find. The next category are the ones I'm most interested in, and that's what you call the experiential extension beyond space-time and consensus reality. And I think that's where we find a lot of these more common parapsychological phenomena, things like telepathy. Telepathic experiences are pretty common. In a survey I did about 16 years ago now, we found that of a sample, fairly decent sized sample of psychedelic users, more than half of them, or about half of them, had said that they'd had an experience of telepathy while under the influence of psychedelics. And if you compare that to non-psychedelic drugs, it was about like 2%, with people on heroin or crack or coffee or alcohol, you just don't really get those kinds of experiences. It was something kind of very common to psychedelics. So telepathic experiences, out-of-body experiences, very common, particularly with dissociative anesthetics like ketamine. Entity encounters, also very common, particularly with your more potent tryptamines like DMT and its derivative ayahuasca. And classically, things with ayahuasca like experiencing a sentient presence of the thing they've ingested. So, encountering the spirit or intelligence of the ayahuasca or the mushrooms that they've ingested. So, but encounters of all kinds, mythological beings, deities, occasionally dead relatives, that kind of thing. So encounter experiences and psychic experiences, I'd say, are probably the most common.
And what about statistical validity of these things? The actual analysis you've done, does it stand up to analysis such as that?
Well, so mine, it was just one sample, but I've done other surveys since, and you kind of get similar figures. It all depends on your sample, right, when you're doing this kind of work, but they are very common. Actually, Roland Griffiths, Johns Hopkins University in the States, has kind of been pioneering a lot of this psychedelic research with psilocybin primarily. They replicated the Good Friday experiment, where they kind of demonstrated like you could have genuine mystical experiences with psilocybin. And he's like, his entire career has been a kind of very upstanding National Institute of Drug Abuse researcher, a leading professor of psychiatry and neuroscience at the top medical university in the States. And he actually asked some of his participants, so how often do you have these, have you ever had any of these experiences, or did you have these experiences? And of course, he got pretty similar figures to what I got. And he published it in a kind of a bit more of an obscure journal as a kind of like an abstract, rather than a fully blown journal of psychopharmacology, or scientific reports kind of prestigious journal report. But he did actually report it, and you came to the same kind of conclusions. These experiences are really common. We don't necessarily know what to make of them, but we shouldn't ignore them either.
Because that's the ongoing problem, isn't it? That people just turn around and say, oh, it's an hallucination, for instance. But of course, we don't know what an hallucination is, you know, and I always point people to the Oliver Sacks book on hallucinations. You know, one thing is we don't know what hallucinations are, and if I hallucinate, it is just because I'm seeing something that other people do not see. But of course, if you argue that my brain is generating an internal facsimile of external reality, it is logical to conclude that I'm still perceiving something that is valid in some way. And of course, I recall many years ago, I think I can't remember the writer now, but there was the argument about the way hallucinations, if I hallucinate, I don't know, a horse standing in front of me, of course, there's a hallucination of exclusion, isn't it? Because the actual visual field that would have been behind the horse had it really been there is actually occluded as well. So there's something more extraordinary going on here. And one of the things that this book here, I was recently re-looking at, and we both contributed chapters to this, by the way, which is really good. Excellent read, edited by Daniel Pinchbeck. But one of the things you say in this book, which was really fascinating, was in your article, you mention about a series of experiments that have been done whereby somebody sees a series of flashing lights or something, and then somebody else in another room, the visual systems of that individual light up in the same way. Am I reading that right? That has been reproduced, the idea that one person can experience something and it's echoed in somebody else's mind in another location?
So yeah, there's been a number of those experiments. They're called distant brain correlation studies. There hasn't been many done in the last few years, but they were kind of quite popular in the kind of late 90s and early noughties. And a bunch of scientists, mostly parapsychologists, were conducting these experiments. So they, yeah, have people separated by distance. At least one of them's got EEG on. Typically, one of the others has been stimulated in some way, and they're able to kind of detect traces of the stimulation to one person's brain in the kind of distant receiver's brain, you know, without them having any kind of conscious experience of that. So at kind of a subconscious level. And from top of my head, there was a review of that literature, and about half of those studies produced positive findings, which is, you know, indicative of something. It's quite interesting research. It actually kind of ties in a bit with what you were just saying about hallucinations in that, you know, if you have an hallucination of a thing that supposedly nobody else can see, then, you know, it's called a hallucination, which, as you say, is a kind of wastebasket term to kind of, it doesn't really explain anything. It's just a kind of label to so you don't have to explain things. But if two people see the same thing, but it's not supposedly there in consensus reality, like a shared hallucination, then you're getting into very different territory. And I think those kind of distant brain correlation studies can perhaps illuminate that a little bit more, in that how is it that physiologically we can see kind of correspondences between different people's brains, particularly if they are emotionally bonded. So most of those studies found that, you know, if you look at people who have an emotional bond, you get more of an effect, or it's more easily detected. And if you use twins, for instance, you get an even stronger effect. So that maybe that kind of speaks to this shared hallucination idea as well.
Yeah, because it always annoys me that they just turn around and then they give it. I call it the label effect, and they'll turn around and call it, it's a folie à deux. So we've explained it. It's a folie à deux, and if there's a lot of people that see it, it's a collective hallucination or whatever. But clearly, there's something quite intriguing here, because I was quite intrigued by the way you described it in many ways, that it's subliminal. It's something that our everyday consciousness is not aware of, but there is a part of us that is somehow getting into this wider area of knowledge that ordinarily we don't do. And it seems peculiar, doesn't it, that we can't perceive these things, but they're happening in our brain. And was I right in saying as well that there was a time element here as well, that there was a kind of a slight idea of precognition taking place as well with these cases?
There was certainly in one study, that was my colleague Marios Katenis. Yeah, he found this kind of like really nice kind of simulacra, but a kind of weaker effect of what's happening in the other person's brain, you know, in the same brain region in the occipital lobe where you'd expect to find it. But it happened just prior to, like a few seconds before. So it was like they were kind of also, their tunes were wired precognitively in a way. Now that kind of, makes it even more mind-boggling, but not necessarily so much when we look at the literature from precognition, particularly the pre-sentiment research from Dean Radin, people like that, where, you know, you show a person a particular stimulus. It could be calming, or it could be, you know, really arousing or kind of violent or something like that, and people will very reliably have a kind of physiological reaction to that. You know, their arousal levels will go up quite quickly. Within a space of 2 or 3 seconds, you can detect it in their skin conductance, you know, the amount of sweat on their fingertips. And yet what they found is that actually, if you look at what's happening just before they show them those images, there is a tendency for people to have the same effect beforehand, but much smaller. So that just before they see an arousing image, they have a little physiological bump. They get kind of slightly aroused. And it's not due to anticipation either, because these are kind of completely randomized experiments. So the precognition effect may not be too disconcerting, although it just makes us scratch our head a bit more.
Yeah, the Radin and Bierman stuff was quite interesting, and I wrote about it many years ago. And one of the things, it would be interesting to have your opinion on this, that I know one of the criticisms of the Bierman and Radin work was that you could explain it by the gambler's fallacy, the idea that if you're expecting something to happen, the longer period of time that it hasn't happened leads you to believe it's likely more to happen next, if that makes sense. Yeah. And therefore the skin conductance is raised because a person thinks, I've just seen lots of photographs of fluffy kittens and sunsets. I know the car crash is coming any second. And I don't know whether there can be a counter argument to that, or whether you think that is a reasonable criticism of that.
But you can look for it statistically, depending on your kind of randomization processes. You can actually test to see if there is a kind of gambler's fallacy effect going on there, right? And I do think there has been some rebuttals to that research that was back in the day. You know, certainly it's been kind of more thoroughly ironed out than that. So I don't think the gambler's fallacy, although it's a good proposition, necessarily stands up. Right, because if it's randomized, it should all kind of be, it should all level out anyway. Although you could look to those sessions where, you know, they'd had 3 calming images and so there was an anticipation. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, because I remember one of the reviewers turning around and saying that it gave the impression that we can in some way monitor the immediate future of our own set of circumstances. And in this, I'm reminded of experiments such as the phi phenomenon, you know, where you get colours changing across a continuum. And people are aware of the fact that the colours are going to change before they even know what colour is going to be changed. And it's the same with Lebet work, and there's various other experiments that have been done that show that it does seem that we know about what something's going to happen. And it's always intrigued me, you know, that sensation you have when you jump and then you hear a sound, you know, a loud bang. I always feel that I'm jumping before I hear the sound. Now, is it because there's a change in the air quality? Is there something else going on here? But these are effects that we all experience. And this now moves us very much onto the area I'm really interested in talking to you about, is that when people take substances such as DMT and ayahuasca and everything else and related, no, it wouldn't be 5-MeO-DMT, would it be? But individuals encounter entities of one description or another. And one of the things would be the wonderful opportunity here for you to explain your own experience with this in India, because I quoted you in one of my books, one of my previous books, because the wonderful experience you had with an entity and the name of the entity which you didn't know about, and the entity spoke to you. So could you tell us a little bit about this, because this is your own experience, isn't it?
Yeah, not just my own experience though, you know, that's a really intriguing thing about it. So I had this encounter. I mean, I'd taken a lot of DMT at this point over a period of time, and then I'm starting to get the kind of point where these entities who would kind of quite reliably show up are like, oh no, not you, we've shown you everything now, just kind of move along, nothing to see here, kind of thing. I was like, oh no, I want to have a look. And then this one last time, this kind of rather terrifying entity just kind of appeared. Not only did it just appear, but it's like I appeared in its space, and it looked kind of surprised to see me. You know, it's like, oh, it's like I'd just been rushed, you know, by like somebody ran up to it, and it was kind of, but it was like an entity kind of covered in a multitude of eyeballs, kind of composed purely of snake bodies. with eyeballs all over them, and kind of saw me, looked a bit shocked, kind of went, "Oh, you're not allowed to see in here," and then kind of proceeded to kind of hypnotize me with its kind of like mesmeric, swirling, smiling eyeball geometrical hypnosis. And so I was like, "Okay, you look pretty terrifying. I'll just just do nothing for the next 10 minutes till the DMT wears off and hope I survive." And of course it did. So I mean, that seemed, I mean, that could have just been a kind of standard random DMT experience, but then by a series of synchronicities, I got to looking at the literature and other people's experiences, and this account, or very similar ones to it, seem to pop up quite a lot with people, particularly people using DMT. Had all the same kind of features: the eyeballs, the tentacles, or snakes, sometimes tentacles, sometimes snakes. The fact that it was guarding something, that it was surprised, that it was menacing, terrifying. So there was this commonality of not just my experiences, but other people who had naively written up their trip reports and posted them on the internet. And also there seemed to be some commonalities with various figures within mythology, particularly Tibetan demonology, which I've kind of also randomly kind of stumbled across at that time. And so, yeah, it seems to be that, how do we understand that? Okay, so there's lots of people having very similar experiences with some kind of entity encounter, which doesn't seem to be particularly well known, but is kind of, it can be seen running through a thread of mythology from various cultures around the world. Are we primed to have those kind of experiences? Are there kind of nodules in the brain which can occasionally be triggered by taking DMT, which enable you to perceive snakes and eyeballs everywhere? Perhaps, but there's various kind of other levels to the experience which become a bit more nuanced and kind of just kind of begs a good interpretation, really. But I try and be agnostic.
What do you think is going on then? What's your professional opinion? What do you think is happening?
I'm not sure I have a professional opinion, really, other than I try to be agnostic. You could look at it in a neurobiological way, like I've just attempted to do. Is there something that the DMT occasionally triggers your eyeballs and snakes, nodules? But then why is it kind of guarding something? Why does it look surprised? Why is it so terrifying? Kind of systematically. Why do people associate it with death? That's a very another common motif with it as well. But it does seem to appear that it has this same mythological structure to it when we look at these, because it's often associated with, well, the angel of death appears to be very similar. This Tibetan demon called Tsar is a guardian of the underworld, keeper of the kind of wisdom of life after death, if you like. So it has this kind of common story. So maybe it is just an occasional neurobiological accident, right, that occurs, but it has a commonality. That's one thing we have to kind of agree on, I think. Well, I mean, we can unpack that, but I think I would say, my professional opinion, there seems to be this kind of complex, in a kind of Jungian sense, of an experience that people can have of an encounter with something that resembles a guardian of the dead, covered in eyeballs and made out of snake bodies. Now, what causes that is the debate. That's debatable. But,
yeah, it's very Lovecraftian, isn't it? Almost Cthulhu and that kind of thing. Sarah, would you like to join in with any comments thus far?
I was just going to ask about ayahuasca and DMT. And I remember, I think I read it in Mark J. Plotkin's book, Tales of a Shaman's Apprentice. And I think it's in his book. And he says something like a shaman or a member of the tribe said to him that if he was going to take ayahuasca, he'd have to be very sort of strong and prepared, because if he doesn't see through the eyes of the spirit sees through his eyes, or it can, if you aren't prepared for it and you're not in a safe place, that it can be really disturbing for someone.
That's an interesting notion. I like that. I haven't read the actual Plotkin book, but I guess what he's alluding to here is the kind of difference between like traditional shamanism, with particularly with psychedelics, is the idea is you don't get possessed, right? You you are under control of yourself and the entities, or at least, you know, you can negotiate with them. Whereas in kind of more traditional, usually non-psychedelic transpossession incorporation work, you kind of offer yourself to be incorporated by the spirit. Now, for some reason, there seems to be a bit of a difference in those practices, you know, between classic transpossession and shamanism, particularly psychedelic shamanism. And, you know, I have yet to find a psychedelic shamanic culture which actively encourages you to get possessed whilst you're under the influence of psychedelics. So there is a difference there, but it does occasionally happen. You know, people have possession-like experiences with psychedelics. And in some cases, in like Brazilian syncretic churches like the Santa Daime, where they've kind of fused bits of kind of European esotericism with African transpossession, with kind of indigenous Amazonian shamanism, they do actually use transpossession with ayahuasca. But I mean, for the life of me, I'm not sure why you would want to. You know, ayahuasca within itself is kind of like quite enough of a ride without being ridden yourself.
I was going to ask about the differences between Westerners taking ayahuasca or DMT in a lab type setting, and this kind of common motif of machine elves, and with more traditional shamanic settings, people tend to see serpents. And do you think there's, because I kind of have this idea that perhaps those substances or those plants that contain DMT kind of click you into nature. So nature, you know, they call it the spirit molecule, so it is like you're actually able to connect to nature more strongly, and with maybe synthesized psychedelics or in a lab setting, you see something different because you're in a different type of environment and you're not enmeshed in that natural world as much.
Yeah, there's a kind of few threads here, isn't there? I mean, so I did some survey work as well, looking at people's kind of like changes in ecological consciousness and with psychedelics. And one of the things I looked at along with the other surveys is you know, people's tendency to ascribe like an experience of encountering the intelligence or spirit of the substance they've ingested, which was very common with ayahuasca and psilocybin mushrooms and salvia, for instance, but very uncommon with ketamine or MDMA, which are completely synthetic. But for, you know, obvious kind of reasons. Interestingly, LSD, which is kind of semi-synthetic, it's derived from nature, but it's chemically changed in the lab. You know, it comes from ergot, but it's a kind of like derivation of it, was somewhere in between. So like, you know, so kind of about half the amount of people it was kind of like, some thought it was, you know, they had encounters with the spirit of LSD, but not as many as with ayahuasca or psilocybin. So there's that sense of which, you know, the degree of syntheticness of the substance you're inducing is related to how much you feel like you're having an encounter with it. But as for like ayahuasca and DMT in particular, yes, it's true that with ayahuasca you tend to get more kind of jungle-like visions, so serpents, jaguars, that kind of thing, according to the work of like Benny Shannon, for instance. Whereas with DMT, you don't get so many serpents or jaguars. You know, jaguars are fairly rare in DMT experiences, I would say. And you do get like machine elves, for instance, although machine elves aren't as common, it turns out, as Terence McKenna would have you believe. I think, you know, somewhere in the kind of like 15 to 25%, depending on which data you look at. So, you know, they pop up quite a bit, definitely. That's not just machine elves, that's all little people, imps, goblins, gnomes, dwarves, you name it. So they're not ubiquitous, but yeah, they certainly are more common than ayahuasca. But why is that? I mean, is it to do with the organic versus synthetic nature of it? Is it to do with lab versus jungle? Is it to do with the duration of the experience? You know, you've got a kind of 4 to 6 hour ayahuasca experiences versus 10 minutes on DMT. Maybe the serpents have moved too slow to get into your DMT vision in time. I don't know.
Thought of that question, you know, like some people say that you should give politicians a trip and then they would make much better decisions in life. I always kind of think that actually a big part of your psychedelic experience will have a lot to do with what your inner world, what's going on in your inner world. So do you think that would work? Does it kind of one size fits all, or do people have very, very different experiences?
So again, there's idiosyncratic differences as well, and this hasn't really been like thoroughly researched, right? It's just in the kind of realm of law, LORE, right? There's no kind of data to go on. You can give opinions, look at kind of examples. But I think one other thing to consider, you know, just to keep an open mind, is like the cultural cosmology as well. So, you know, ayahuasca is used, is evolved around, you know, cosmological ideas about ayahuasca as it is embedded within their an indigenous culture's mythology. And there's lots of indigenous tribes who use it, but it's been around for maybe 500 years, maybe longer. So it has that kind of history to it, which is suffused within the cultural use of it on a kind of earthly level. But if you kind of take the idea of somebody like, you know, Rupert Sheldrake, and or, you know, the idea of the Akasha, or Jung's ideas of collective unconscious, then it also has a kind of history, a cosmological history there in the kind of the transpersonal realm as well. Whereas DMT, on its own, you know, is a relatively new animal, right? So, because ayahuasca is a mixture of DMT and other chemicals, right? It's a kind of a melange, it's a cauldron of different things. So DMT on its own has it's kind of like new to the table. It doesn't necessarily have that kind of cosmology around it, other than what's been created by Terence McKenna and Rick Strassman and everyone since then. So it's a kind of rawer experience, if you like. So it'd be interesting to explore this, as Rupert Sheldrake suggested in our book DMT Dialogues. You know, take a newly discovered psychedelic drug, and you could experiment with it, you know, around the notions of a morphic field. You know, can people taking it for the first time in one particular environment kind of flavor the kind of experiences that other people will have when they take it, you know, after that. So you say if you took it in a kind of Japanese flower garden the very first time, would other people have, you know, elements of a Japanese flower garden in their experiences? So you could potentially, I mean, it's not easy, but you could test this experimentally. And I think that's a really nice proposal. And maybe things like ketamine, which again are completely synthetic. There's no organic analog that we know of. You know, it's been created purely in the lab. They do seem to have somehow the least amount of cosmology kind of stuck to them, you know, in a way. They have a bit of a lore around them, like, you know, you have the K-hole and you have the out-of-body experience and everything goes a bit weird, but there's no specific entities particularly that people report in those kind of experiences, right? They seem to be like the kind of neutral robot digital version of all your kind of cosmologized, mythologized psychedelics in a way.
This is quite fascinating, because one of the areas that my research is taking me into at the moment is the concept of what I'm calling the egregorial, the way in which it seems that collective anticipations of the collective unconscious, or whatever we want to call it, can somehow imbue itself upon consensual reality. And it's quite intriguing, the point you were making there, and I'd never thought about that before, that these substances themselves seem to create certain entities in certain ways, because we're almost anticipating that's what we're going to find, isn't it? You know, it's as if somehow the collective unconscious, the Jungian collective unconscious, whatever we want to believe, is somehow imbuing itself upon the substance itself. So there's an almost feedback mechanism taking place here. And from this, I'm very intrigued as to how you feel things like near-death experiences specifically relate to this. Is the relationship between maybe potential endogenous DMT and the near-death experience, or is that something that people are jumping to big conclusions when it's not really valid to do so?
I'd love for you to get my PhD student on here, Pascal Michael. So he's kind of dedicated himself the last few years to actually studying this very question. His thesis is, you know, the relationship between DMT and near-death experiences, and he's kind of drilling into it in a very profound and deep way. And of course, there are some kind of overlaps, you know, quite a lot on paper. You know, when you give people who've had DMT, like a breakthrough high dose of DMT, a kind of near-death experience questionnaire, it looks like they've had a near-death experience. It looks like they've had a mystical experience as well. It looks like they've had a really intense psychedelic experience, but they tick all the same boxes as somebody who's had a kind of classic near-death experience, right? But that's on paper with these kind of rather crude measures and scales. When you drill into the phenomenology, there is a lot of overlap, but there's a lot of mismatches as well. So, you know, you don't get these kind of intense, colorful geometric patterns, particularly in near-death experiences. They do occasionally happen, but not very often. You don't really meet deceased relatives very often on DMT. They do occasionally happen, but not as much as they do with near-death experiences. So you can actually, you could probably say that all of the features of the near-death experience and the DMT experience pretty much can be found, maybe not both ways. Maybe all of the features of near-death experience can be found in DMT, and a lot of the features of DMT can be found in some near-death experiences. But so you've kind of got this Venn diagram overlap, but you never find a DMT experiences which ticks 4 or 5 of the near-death experience boxes, right? It's just like there's never one experience which looks like a near-death experience on its own, but collectively, if you kind of scale them all and average it, it might, oh yeah, it looks a bit like that. So there's a mismatch there. And then there's, on a kind of neurobiological level, some really brilliant research coming out of the States, a bit awful in a way, because they're kind of euthanizing lab animals to see what happens at the point of death in terms of their biochemistry, their neurochemistry. And they're finding that, yeah, of course, in fact, this is fascinating. They're finding, they're finding DMT in their brain, but that it jumps 6-fold at the point of death, which, says something perhaps for Strassman's near-death experience theory about it being produced by endogenous in the body DMT. They also found that if they take the pineal gland out of them beforehand to see if it's pineal based, they still have an increase in their brain DMT at the point of death. It's only 3-fold, in fact, though. So it could be, like I say, maybe the pineal gland is in some way implicated in the production of DMT at death.
This is interesting. Is this the Gimo Borgigian stuff?
Yeah, that's the GMO stuff, yeah.
Really? Because that's fascinating. So just to clarify there, what they've done is they've actually found that there's a 12-fold increase when the pineal gland is active in the brain.
6-fold.
6-fold, sorry. And then if they remove the pineal gland, the amount of DMT that's actually found within the brain is still there. It's decreased by a certain amount.
Yeah,
that is
half the amount.
That is fascinating, isn't it?
You can't make too much out of it, though, because they had different baseline levels, unfortunately, in the different groups. So it's kind of like how you interpret that is still questionable. It needs more research.
Very cruel.
It's very cruel.
Yes,
yeah.
It is.
I mean, it's like, okay, it's really interesting to find that out. I'm not really a big animal research fan, myself, but it's still fascinating. What the important point is, though, that there is, so DMT, right? It could be involved in the near-death experience. What that story doesn't tell you alone is that there is a massive increase in all of the brain monoamines, such as serotonin increases like 150 times. Your normal serotonin levels shoot up like, astronomical quantities of serotonin. So much so that it would probably flood the receptors and DMT wouldn't even activate the serotonergic receptors. Noradrenaline shoots up, I can't remember, like 50-fold or 30-fold.
What about glutamate? Because I know Carl Janssen did a lot of work on this as well, and with his work with ketamine, and Orla Karatza, as I recall. But in terms of glutamate flood, does that also occur as well?
There is a glutamate flood as well, of course. I mean, you get that with anoxia anyway. And Janssen's theory was that a ketamine-like substance in the brain would protect the brain from the implosion of the brain cells that occurs from a glutamate flood, right? Edie Frexker, as you spoke to, he said he found the same thing with DMT as well. It's neuroprotective against ischemia and apoxia, and whatever it is when you don't get oxygen to the brain. I'm not a medical doctor. So, there's some interesting stuff here, but I don't think it points to the idea that you can't just look to DMT, I don't think, as the near-death experience trigger or mimic, but rather if you were to kind of create a cocktail, like the near-death experience cocktail, it'd be like, right, we're going to give you this much serotonin, we're going to give you a bit of squirt of DMT, we're going to give you a load of noradrenaline. I mean, that might induce a near-death like experience.
That makes me think about dreams, because you have that experience in dreams, and if you aren't with noradrenaline especially, you would have a kind of waking dream experience, a really intense one, if your brain's flooded with those kind of neurotransmitters all at once. And I've had experiences that weren't necessarily actual real risk of dying too seriously, but where I've had so much adrenaline that later on I felt there's this kind of like counter flooding. I can feel that my neurochemistry is changing, and then I'll have really intense dreams or something like that afterwards. And I feel like the near-death experience is quite similar to lucid dream experience in some way.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's an overlap in all of these things, and I think DMT is probably part of the puzzle. And I think, you know, Janssen's, you know, endogenous glutamate antagonist, like that ketamine mimics, is probably part of the story as well. But there doesn't seem to be like any one molecule, I say, we could pin the near-death experience on. That's what seems to be coming out of Gmo's lab, right? And it's actually, as ever, it's always way more complex. The further you drill down into it, you don't get any closer to a simple solution. It just gets more and more complex, and you go, oh god, it's kind of turtles all the way down. But I think, you know, the overlap, yeah, with kind of some dreams, lucid dream experiences, near-death experiences, DMT. And this was the thing about DMT in Strassman's book, right? You know, saying, oh, it's like the near-death experience, but it's also a bit like sleep paralysis, and it's also a bit like alien abduction phenomena. And, you know, so, well, only one chemical that explains everything doesn't really explain very much, right? So, but I think it certainly must be part of the explanation. I think at least it's like downstream, it's triggering something that stimulates kind of occasional near-death like experiences, or it's certainly pretty profound and mind-blowing what's going on, you know.
The time perception element of it's very interesting. What do you know about the time perception of DMT, especially in ayahuasca?
Well, it doesn't seem especially changed, actually, which is quite curious. It's not something that people kind of point to very often. Occasionally people do say it seemed to last like eons, but usually people are like, even they're talking like intense breakthrough 10-minute experiences. People generally have like, they're kind of in a clock working quite well. You know, they come out of it and it's like, oh yeah, it was 10 minutes. Sometimes I've had reports of people saying, one guy had an experience where one of our participants, and he basically got to the point where he lit the pipe, and then something kind of weird happened, and he was just like, he was a child, and then he lived his whole life. And
wow, that sounds amazing.
Yeah, and then he got to the point where he lived his whole life, and he got to the point where he was just about to light the pipe, and then he started hallucinating. And he said he thought the experience basically lasted about, you know, 25 years, which is quite bonkers.
This is so important.
That's
the point you've just made.
The inner light, Star Trek Next Generation.
Exactly. And David, I don't know how much you know about my cheating the ferryman hypothesis.
A little bit. It sounds a bit like that, right?
Okay, but the cheating hypothesis, this very much argues that the point of death, the what people normally call the Grayson trait of the panoramic life review, you know, my life flashed before my eyes. What I argue in my cheating the ferryman hypothesis is that in a real death experience, your life doesn't flash before your eyes. You live within a simulation of your own life, which is a literal minute-by-minute recreation. Now, I recall, and you'll probably know this, that I think Aldous Huxley had a similar experience in a laboratory. I think in the laboratory of the guy that got him the
Osmond?
Yeah, Osmond. Yeah, Osmond. I think it was Osmond. And he felt he lived a whole life. And he remembers going back and being a child in a field. And he remembers feeling hungry. And what he's doing is he's watching this child, because he walks along and he sees a child lying there, and he realises this baby is hungry. Then he realises the baby is him. And then he follows this baby as an observer of this baby's life, with this almost mind meld to the baby. And he carries this child's life right through to when he's about 17 or 18. So again, it's very intriguing here. And this really, really fascinates me, the time dilation elements that take place in these circumstances, and what this can tell us about the near-death experience and the much not discussed panoramic life review, because it's quite extraordinary, this as well. So if you can put me in contact with that person that had that experience, I'd love to speak to them, really seriously.
Yeah, I have to say that was kind of like the only such account of that we've had. So it may be possible with DMT, and it seemed to trigger it on that occasion, but it's is a pretty rare occurrence. I haven't heard of anything like that with DMT, really, and that was quite surprising to have him tell us that story.
Extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary.
Yeah, it's just kind of, I mean, anything is possible, right, in these states. It's kind of, the kinds of experiences you can have are kind of limitless. Although there are commonalities, generally speaking, and but then there's always these kind of rare ones where anything can happen, right?
Everything can and will happen, as Brian Cox and Jeff Forshaw's book said.
Right.
So in terms of your own work, I mean, for you, what phenomena still remains unexplained? You know, I mean, clearly it's an area that fascinates you. So what remains unexplained? There's tons of things. All of it, really. Yeah. But which areas are fascinating you at the moment? Where's your research taking you?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, yeah. I mean, let's start by explaining consciousness, and then all the rest of it will fit into place. But that's the kind of one of the kind of charges you get, isn't it? As like doing research in this area as parapsychology, is like, well, how do you explain it works, and how does psychic abilities, how does precognition work? And it's, well, I don't know. And you're like, well, it's a terrible science, then, isn't it? Well, you can't explain consciousness. So I'm not going to attempt to explain any of that just yet, but what I'm excited about and what I'm researching on is DMT. Currently, we're still doing we're doing the analysis on the research we did, our first phase of the study. We looked at precognition with DMT, telepathy, a little bit, just kind of like testing out the protocol, really, and shared visionary experiences, which I'm hoping to I need to analyze that data, but that was kind of extremely promising. So 2 people on DMT at the same time, you know, you separate them off afterwards, you interview them, you get them to draw sketches, and is there a commonality between what they say and see? But we need to kind of test that on kind of independent judges to find out. On the surface of it, it looks really compelling, much better than I anticipated it. My research currently is taking me off into just going back over to some old research I've wanted to do for years, is looking at lucid dreaming, actually, for precognition, because there's been, you know, 50 years of maybe more, 60 years of good dream ESP research looking at telepathy and precognition. I've been involved in some of that, but no one's ever used lucid dreamers in that research, and it would seem like they are the people who are best able to probably do this. So finally doing that, I got a small grant for that. I've also got a small grant to look at weather control, shamanic weather control, and I hope to do that with the Ruradica, indigenous community from Mexico, who make use of peyote cactus, and I've seen them do some pretty far out things. So including supposedly moving an extremely large dust devil in the desired direction once upon a time. So I'm looking at that, yeah, just kind of also, but looking into more kind of, I'm going a bit normal in my old age as well. I seem to be doing just kind of like less kind of hyper weird psychedelic research. So just looking at things like neurodiversity, and psychedelics. So people with autism, how do they experience psychedelics? People with aphantasia, that's really interesting. People have mind blindness who see nothing in their mind's eye. What happens when you give them hardcore psychedelics? Turns out nothing, which is really surprising. Even though they have entity encounters, you know, these people can smoke DMT and have like a whole narrative journey. They met elves, they were on a kind of roller coaster ride, but they didn't see anything, you know.
Way weird.
Yeah, it's really weird. And
even change, because I've been contacted by some with aphantasia, and they said that they've had a few dreams where they see things, but they can't visually imagine anything.
Yeah, so about half of people with aphantasia, and actually a large portion of the population have aphantasia, it turns out. We only knew about it about 5 years ago when it was given a name, and since then, turns out about maybe somewhere between 2 and maybe 8% of the population have aphantasia. And about half of them will have dreams with visual elements, although they can't recall it, because when they're not dreaming, they can't generate any visual imagery to remember visual things, which is kind of a bit of a paradox. But also then congenital blindness, so people not just with mind blindness but actual blindness, what their psychedelic experience is like. And that was kind of stimulated by the research with near-death experiences like Kenneth Rinn looking at blind people, congenitally blind people saying they can see things, you know. So we've started looking to see, well, might really intense psychedelics also lead blind people to have some kind of experience of seeing, like a kind of direct perception, obviously not seeing with their eyes, but in the same way blind people do with near-death experiences, they have these kind of disembodied, like out of body like experiences.
Yeah, because it's almost touching into synesthesia, isn't it? And the Vicky Ompeg case, wasn't it? It was one of the blind people, one of the blind individuals that had most profound near-death experiences, and seemed to be able to see and report things as well, which is. Well, we're quickly coming to the end. We've got about 2 or 3 minutes. I want to just. I've always wanted to ask you this as well. So, in terms of what are the most extraordinary phenomena you've encountered? What are the things that in your research you've gone, wow, that was just amazing?
Well, there is lots of mind-blowing stuff, like blind people seeing things. That was always, you know, that's always top of the miracles list, isn't it? But my own experiences have been pretty mind-blowing. But I'm not going to bore you with all my drug experiences and dreams because we don't have time. Having kind of synesthesia of everything is kind of quite a fun experience. Like, so not just kind of seeing sounds or tasting them or feeling them, but being sound. That's quite something to behold. And recently, just, you know, which I'm really wanting to explore for a while, like I say, is probably that experience of seeing these we were confronted with a ginormous dust devil was moving towards us, and there was these couple of Mexican shamans who hadn't noticed it, and I was like, guys, it was just about to hit us, and they kind of just turned around and kind of casually bat it away and then get back to arguing, which is what they were doing at the time it kind of attacked us. And it was like, okay, you can move ginormous dust devils, I like that. But yeah, there's always so much weird phenomena to explore, and I think it's the anomalies are the most interesting because they tell us so much about, you know, the nature of reality.
Absolutely. So if anybody wants to contact you or is interested in your work, where are the avenues that they could follow through? Maybe interested in following a PhD program with you or something. How would they contact you? Website, that kind of thing?
Yeah, just look at the University of Greenwich, Dr. David Luke, and my contact details on there. And yeah, please do drop me a message.
Wonderful. One of the things we were talking about before was time dilation, and Sarah and I find that I cannot believe that was an hour. I in no way can I believe that we've been on for an hour. David, that has been absolutely extraordinary, and I think we really do need to have you back to be on an Incon, which are normally 2.5 hours, because I think we literally have just scraped the surface here. And we have just scraped the surface because it's so fascinating. So thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. I'm really, really grateful for this. And again, everybody, Sarah and I are back doing all this again tomorrow at 3:00, when we'll be discussing the Philip K. Dick Film Festival and having a 2-hour discussion on matters Philip K. Dickian, which should be a really, really fascinating exercise. So everybody, thanks again for listening in. And again, as always, thank you for Sarah for all her amazing hard work in the background. And I think a lot of you have already given me feedback that you really like the new design of the posters that we're using as well. That's all down to Sarah. So it's really good, really, really creative. And thank you again to our guest, David Luke, and we will see you all soon. Okay, thank you very much, and have a wonderful rest of your weekend.
Thanks.
Thank you.